Well, good evening, everybody. Let me welcome you to the Sydney Conservatorium of Music. I'm the Dean of the Conservatorium, Anna Reid, and I'm very, very pleased to see so many people here at the recital hall and, of course, so many people online tonight as well. I hope that you each have an excellent experience. We're sitting on probably one of the most important sites in Australia. This is the spot where Europeans first met Aboriginals for the very, very first time. Specifically, they met the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This was a very, very special spot for the Gadigal because it was the spot where young men were initiated into dog and kangaroo dance, which basically said, if you've done dog and kangaroo dance and you're initiated, you've been through university, you know what you're doing, you understand what it is to be an adult in the community. And a lot of that knowledge was passed on through singing and through dance, so which is what is so special now about the Sydney Conservatorium, because we're on this site where people have been learning stuff through music for over 60,000 years. So I acknowledge the elders past and present, and here I always like to remind ourselves that we have a lot of young people coming through who are going to be the leaders of the future, so I give my respect to those young people as well. And how wonderful it is to have everybody here tonight from all over the place. In particular, our special guest Harry White, all the way from Dublin, having had his first longest trip around the world, and still manages to be cheerful to speak with us today. And I really want to say thank you to Alan, because he has been on this project for years. And every time I go, yeah, right, we'll do that, something cataclysmic happens, so that we actually have the Caldara Symposium starting tomorrow, as well as a Hook lecture happening today. It's all due to Alan's total persistence and his never say no attitude. So thank you so much, Alan, for having an academic and creative mind that brings it together. So have a really lovely time both here and also at the conference tomorrow. And I'm going to hand over to my Associate Dean of Research.
Thank you very much, Anna, and good evening to everyone. Welcome, as Anna said, to the Conservatorium. It's so wonderful to have this first Hook lecture this year. I'm the Associate Dean of Research. My name is Neil Perez-da-Costa, and I'd like to really welcome a truly extraordinary scholar, Professor White, from University College Dublin. We heard his lecture last night at the Chow Chak Museum, and it was inspiring and so interesting. He's such an amazing person to meet. He's very humorous. And I'll leave it to Alan to do a proper introduction, but and Alan will do that in a few minutes. But I'd just like to say a few words about research here at the Conservatorium. We're one of the most dynamic research institutions in Australia, and our research extends across lots of subdisciplines in music, from Western classical to Indigenous, non-Western musics, jazz, contemporary, popular, and music improvisation, very importantly. We support artistic research, music diversity, musicology, and, again, very importantly, music education. And we also foster strong collaborations with industry partners, and here at the university with multidisciplinary institutions, for example, the Brain and Mind Centre, Sydney Environment, the Charles Perkins Centre, and the China Studies Centre, a few that we work with. And we also host Paradisec, which is a world-class digital archive of records from many of the endangered cultures in the Pacific region and beyond. So a little bit about the Hook lecture series. Alfred Samuel Hook was born in 1886 and died in 1963. He was a practicing architect who believed very much in architecture, like music. He believed that architecture, like music, was an art vital to people's prosperity. He helped found the University of Sydney's Faculty of Architecture in 1918, from which he retired as Dean in 1949. Hook's other great love was music. He gave lunch hour concerts on the history of music, illustrated by the university's collection of gramophone records. He was a member of the university's choral group and, as a keen organist, was associated with installing the university's War Memorial Carillon in 1928, and also, for some of us this is very important, founding the Department of Music in 1948. The Alfred Hook lecture is made possible through a generous bequest from Doreen Robson. So, as I said, tonight's Hook Lecture is the first for this year. We usually only have one in the year, but because we haven't had anything for a long time now, we're having a second one, and I just want to advertise that. It's going to be given by American violinist Nicole Cherry on the 25th of November. And this is going to be part of a wonderful symposium, another symposium this year for the Conservatorium, called Reimagining Musical Programming. So if you're interested to come, please have a look on the SCM research pages and you'll find the page for that symposium. And without further ado, I'll pass on to Alan to introduce Professor White.
Thank you, Neil. So my name's Alan Maddox. I'm Program Leader of Musicology at the Conservatorium, but for the purposes of this evening, perhaps more importantly, I'm a researcher in the music of the early 18th century, which is, of course, an interest shared with Professor White. And in that context, it's an absolute delight to welcome Professor Harry White to the University of Sydney. This lecture is, in a sense, as Anna hinted, the culmination of plans conceived several years ago when my colleague Jinyan Chen and I won a bilateral grant from our two universities, the University of Sydney and National Taiwan University, to fund a pair of symposia in Taipei and Sydney centred on the Italian composer Antonio Caldara, a crucial figure in the generation of J.S. Bach, Handel and Vivaldi, who, for reasons which I think we'll hear more about in a moment, has for the most part been sorely neglected in the historiography of the period. A centrepiece of the planned Sydney meeting was to have been a keynote address by Professor White under the auspices of the Sydney Conservatorium's prestigious Alfred Hook Lecture. Those events fell victim to the pandemic. However, Professor Chen and I were able to convene a smaller online colloquium in late 2021 to help build and maintain connections between scholars in this area, and that work will continue this weekend with the symposium Antonio Caldara and the Performance of Power, which the Conservatorium will be hosting online, with sessions chaired by Professor White and Professor Chen, and presentations from scholars around the world. A crucial missing piece in the puzzle, however, has been the long-awaited Alfred Hook Lecture. At times it has seemed as if the fates were conspiring against us, from the pandemic to the intricacies of visa processing to the death of Queen Elizabeth II, which resulted in an unexpected public holiday just today, making our usually buzzing music school something of a ghost town, and even to today's rather inclement weather. And yet here we are at last, both here in the room and, I think for the first time in the history of the Hook Lecture, with a large audience of listeners around the world via YouTube to hear Professor White's presentation. Harry White is Professor of Music at University College Dublin. He was elected to the Royal Irish Academy in 2006, the Academy of Europe in 2015, and the Croatian Academy of Sciences and Arts in 2018. He was inaugural president of the Society for Musicology in Ireland and is perhaps best known as a cultural historian of music in Ireland, on which subject he has published over 80 papers and book chapters and 3 monographs. The Keeper's Recital in 1998, The Progress of Music in Ireland in 2005, and Music and the Irish Literary Imagination in 2008. He was also general editor with Professor Barra Boydell, who I'm delighted to say is here with us this evening, welcome Barra, of the Encyclopedia of Music in Ireland, published in Dublin in 2013. Other recent publications include The Well-Tempered Festschrift and Music, Migration and European Culture, the latter edited with Ivano Cavallini and Jolanta Guzzi-Pasiak, both published in 2020. Professor White has also published extensively on music in early 18th century Austria, particularly the music of Johann Joseph Fux, and particularly notable for our purposes this evening is his important monograph, The Musical Discourse of Servitude, Authority, Autonomy, and the Work Concept in Fux, Bach and Handel, published by OUP in 2020, which I think it's fair to say provided the genesis for some of the ideas which Professor White will explore further with us this evening. Although the topic of music at aristocratic courts in Europe 3 centuries ago may feel remote from our present concerns, the legacy of the music created then remains firmly embedded in our modern music cultures, and what we can learn from it about the way that music mediates cultural, political, and economic power can illuminate the ways in which those forces continue to operate today, not least observable in the spectacularly performative ceremonies for the death of Queen Elizabeth in recent days. The power of music in history, culture, and ceremony also ties us potently to this place, as Anna said. The Conservatorium's location here by the harbour, close to a site which has been so important in Indigenous music and culture over many millennia, means that in introducing Professor White, I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this unceded land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to their elders past, present and emerging, who continue to care for country and maintain culture. And so, with his feet at last firmly on the ground here in Sydney, at this ancient place of cultural sharing, please join me in welcoming Professor Harry White to deliver the 2022 Alfred Hook Lecture, The Sovereign Ghost, Antonio Caldara, and the Eclipses of Cultural History.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan, for that extremely generous and eloquent and also very interesting introduction. It's quite something to have this forthcoming lecture contextualized in such a profound way and echoing what Neil and indeed Anna had already said. It's a huge honor for me to be here. I don't disguise that for a moment, and a singular one, to address this gathering in Sydney, this wonderful, vibrant city, which, as Anna indicated, I'm visiting for the first time, indeed Australia for the first time. And I owe that honour chiefly, of course, to my friend and colleague Alan Maddox, who first wrote to me almost 3 years ago to propose that I deliver this Alfred Hook Memorial Lecture, a proposal that I joyously accepted. Nevertheless, again, as Alan has said, the big viral C intervened, and I'm using that descriptive capital letter to some purpose, as I hope shall become clear later on, just as it did across the globe. Not least on that account, I'm relieved as well as delighted to have undertaken this stupendous journey in order to make good on Alan's gracious invitation at last. And so my first duty is to extend my ardent thanks to Alan Maddox and to his colleagues at the Conservatorium for everything they have done to make this visit not only possible, an absolutely relevant term, but also extremely pleasurable. And in particular, I would like to, as it were, identify not only Alan, but also Megan Bioch. Meg was just remarkable. I think heroic is probably the right term for her in terms of the number of times she saved our bacon when we were trying to make this happen. And indeed her colleague, Kirsty McCahan, with whom I had several emails. I'm simply delighted that Professor Anna Reid, the Dean of this faculty and of the Conservatorium, is here this evening, and indeed that her Associate Dean, Professor Neil Perez da Costa, who spoke so interestingly a few moments ago, is also here. I also need to say that despite the I think ordeal, I think Alan would say, is a justified term of actually making this happen, it was worth the trip just to be in this building. Alan showed it to me on Tuesday afternoon last, and it was, of course, a regular day in term, and the place was humming. And it isn't just the majesty and unaccustomed intimacy which rub shoulders together in this building, but the sheer panoptic fulcrum of musical engagement that one becomes aware of the moment you walk in those big plate glass doors and see this long vista leading, in fact, to this very theatre we're speaking in, and then to hear people rehearsing, we heard somebody rehearsing the magic flute, and there was a wind band and so on. And just the sheer accumulative majesty of all of that musical engagement on this historic spot, on this very important part of Australian land, was actually quite an overwhelming and very moving experience. And it intensifies as well as enhances the honour of being here. Bara, who is in the audience tonight, will remember a conference that I organised with Bara's colleague Patrick Devine in Maynooth University in 1995. It really was the first big major international musicological conference. And the keynote speaker on that occasion was the late and great Joseph Carman. And at the gathering of the conference, my colleague Patrick went to Joe Carman, and he said very almost obsequiously, Professor Carman, we are now ready to escort you and Mrs. Carman to the Archbishop of Armagh's private suite. And Carman, without turning a hair, said, trumpets, drums? And it was the same sort of sensation I felt when I came into the conservatory on Tuesday afternoon. I also wanted to reflect on the fact that Australians are extraordinary and hardy travellers, and a great many Irish people, of course, including people of my age and much younger, have made Australia their home. And I can say without a trace of irony that despite the inordinate paperwork which was required to have me come safely through immigration, which in the end turned out to be a very swift and pleasant experience, the uppermost word in my mind since I arrived here is grace. I cannot believe the number of people who were expecting me and strangers on the street whom I shall never see again, who were so engagingly graceful to me. I've never experienced it to such an extent that people would take such an intelligent and courteous interest in the mere fact that one's standing on the street or about to do something within their own environment. So again, I feel very grateful, and I think it's worth saying that. And I say it to the audience here this evening, here in Sydney, but also, if I might dare add, and extend a warm welcome to the many people around the globe, as Alan said, who are listening and viewing this lecture today. When I was in the sort of miasma of extreme jet lag on Tuesday morning, the early hours of Tuesday morning, I began to envisage the kind of nimbus of a poem which would reflect all of the paperwork that Alan and I had to do, particularly with regard to the visa. And the first lines of this poem came to me. I don't know if I'll ever write it or not, but I called the poem Question 11. Thinking in the manner of W.H. Auden, I'll just read you what I wrote down. I said, if your answer is yes to question 11, please turn directly to page 27. If your answer to question 11 is no, I'm afraid you have much, much further to go. And I have to say that I'm very glad finally to have reached the termination signified by that instruction. There are two other things I would like to say just before I embark on the lecture proper. One is that I would like very much to thank Anika Babel and Owen Corrigan, both PhD students in musicology at University College Dublin, for providing decisive and much needed assistance with the slideshow, both here this evening at the Hook Lecture and last night for my lecture on Irish music. So I'm very grateful to Owen and Anika for their help in that regard. And secondly, as a kind of incidental preliminary, but one that struck me very much, just round the corner from my hotel is the Museum of Sydney, and they are currently featuring an exhibition called Visions of a City That Might Have Been. And when I saw that, I thought maybe I should change the title of my lecture to Visions of a Musical History That Might Have Been, because there is something subjunctive in both of those titles, and my own preoccupations this evening somehow glance off and echo the subjunctive mood of that museum exhibition. There is an apocryphal but apparently true story told about Norman Mailer and Gore Vidal, those rival titans of 20th century American letters, which came to my mind when I sat down to contemplate the not insignificant challenge of talking about the Venetian composer Antonio Caldara before an audience not especially concerned with or even aware of his life and music. To complicate matters, but in a very agreeable, if somewhat daunting way, there are in fact several persons here tonight, Alan is one of them, many of them are online, who know a great deal more about Caldara than I do. So I am steering a middle course between the Scylla and Charybdis of a formidable body of specialized knowledge far greater than my own, and the more general demands of a public lecture. I hope, nevertheless, that I can navigate safely past these rival claims and reach the terra firma of my destination. But first, that story about Vidal and Mailer. Norman Mailer had published a volume of his memoirs and invited his old adversary, Gore Vidal, to attend the book launch. In the book signing queue, Vidal duly approached Mailer with a freshly purchased copy of the book in his hand. When he saw him, Mahler said, "Oh, no, I have a specially signed copy put aside for you already. Please accept it with my compliments." Vidal reports that later that evening, when he got back to his apartment, he turned to the index of the book in which Mahler had written in pen beside Vidal's name, "Hi, Gore." And as a second example of that came from Alan Bennett, the great English dramatist, who a few years ago was sent a copy of Waterstone's literary diary. And he examined various dates of writers he knew, Ian McEwan and Kazuo Ishiguro, and on their birthdays, dates were their names and what they had written. But when he turned to the 9th of May, his own birthday, he saw that there was nothing there. There was no acknowledgement of Alan Bennett, except for a little note that said, "The first self-service laundrette opened in the Queensway, London, on this date," in 1949. So those two little anecdotes about Mahler and Gore Vidal and Alan Bennett, I've told them because they express a kind of anxiety that authors and academics especially are prone to, and particularly academics who go often straight to the index of a monograph, which is rarely, that vanity is rarely, if ever so wittily, punctured as in Vidal's case. But just as Mahler knew his man, I'm willing to bet that many of us academics have either been relieved or offended by the presence or absence of our names in the index of a learned monograph. To be included, to be wanted on the voyage, is the writer's abiding anxiety. To be eclipsed is his or her most wounding dereliction. Not even the fiercest adverse criticism, certain spectacular acts of verbal violence accepted, can induce the dejection of discovering one has been left out altogether. Total eclipse, no sun, no moon, as Milton Sampson said of his blindness, and for much of the past 300 years, one might well say the same thing of Antonio Caldara. Imagine a history of art in which the landscapes of Constable were remaindered to the archive or the narrow purview of specialists, or a history of literature in which Keats's odes were lost to general circulation. It's easy if you try, as John Lennon said about heaven, and you can form some idea of the immense silence which descended for centuries upon most of Caldara's vast output. To identify Caldara as a prodigious and seminal presence in the great unfolding and industrious growth of 18th century music doesn't much help. His auditory presence, his astonishing operatic representations of the Baroque cosmos of power, his singular but radically under-researched contribution to the development of Austro-Italian church music, and to the Mass and Oratorio in particular, are sunken cathedrals in the oceanic depths of a largely forgotten history. Caldara, in a phrase, is the sovereign ghost of the 18th century musical imagination. And here he is. The sovereign ghost, the phrase belongs to the American poet Wallace Stevens, who used it at the outset of his monumental poem, The Comedian as the Letter C, published in 1923 in Stevens' first collection, Harmonium. And I quote, "Nota, man is the intelligence of his soil, the sovereign ghost," unquote. For my purposes, the title of Stevens' poem could be recast as The Composer as the Letter C, especially with these following lines in mind, in which the persona of Stevens' poem, Crispin, could just as well be Antonio Caldara. Crispin was washed away by magnitude. The whole of life that still remained in him dwindled to one sound strumming in his ear, ubiquitous concussion, slap and sigh, polyphony beyond his baton's thrust. Antonio Caldara was likewise washed away by the magnitude of a reception history indifferent to his music in its ardent recovery of Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel. It is this eclipse that I would like to consider this evening, but as my title indicates, the phenomenon of cultural eclipse is as vital to my modest purposes as is the particular case of Caldara himself. To that end, I have divided this talk into three sections. the first and third of which privilege Caldara and, as it were, his immediate cultural quandaries, whereas the second section widens the lens a little to consider the exemplary problem of retrieving Caldara as a composer in the cultural upheaval of present-day Europe. And so my headings are Antonio Who, secondly, A History of Western Music, chapter 99, and thirdly, The Tyranny of Dreams in B minor. Antonio Who. Antonio Caldara was born in Venice in 1670. I'm only kidding. I'm not kidding. That sounds like the beginning of a very trite biographical account, but in the case of Caldara, there's no joke at all, because it was only 3 years ago that Caldara's date of birth, 6th of January 1670, was discovered thanks to Alan Maddox's research in the Venetian archives. Even the revised edition of the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians from 2001 left matters dangling with question mark 1671. It seems inconceivable that someone once so famous, proverbially the go-to man for operatic fantastications on the most extravagant scale throughout Austria and northern Italy, should have had to wait so long to have his date of birth discovered and confirmed. Caldara's roll call of illustrious appointments as Maestro di Capella to the Duke of Mantua from 1699 until 1707, to Prince Francesco Maria Ruspoli in Rome, where he succeeded Handel from 1709 until 1716, and principally perhaps as deputy Kapellmeister to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna from 1716 until his death in 1736, would remain unsurpassed throughout the 18th century. And there are just a list of those appointments. These appointments, together with the dizzying array of commissions he received from Salzburg, Venice, Rome, Milan, Barcelona at the court of Charles III of Spain, who would return to Austria in 1711 on the death of his feckless brother Joseph I, and of course from Vienna itself, made Caldara one of the most famous and widely circulated composers of his day. In Vienna, where he was appointed by the emperor against the recommendation of imperial Kapellmeister Johann Joseph Fux, who preferred the much more modestly endowed Francesco Scarlatti, his salary was at one time 3 times that of his immediate superior. He was without doubt the emperor's favorite composer, but in that uniquely privileged position of esteem, he worked himself to death. Here is Johann Joseph Fux in a painting that dates from 1716, which is the year that Caldara joined the court. I really have always wondered what the relationship between these two men actually was. I think it must have been very unsettling for Fux, who was remarkably appointed to that position. I mean remarkable insofar as he was a homegrown Austrian, whereas most of the musical personnel in court were Italian. So that when Caldara finally showed up, I think the atmosphere, at least initially, must have been quite tense. And then silence. A composer whose work had been at least as famous and widely circulated as Handel's, and who was incontestably better known than Bach, except in Lutheran Germany, was without much notice reduced to the ranks of historical interest. One might arguably add that this was the fate of virtually the entire Austro-Italian Baroque until its revival in the 1950s and 1960s, but the swift decline of Caldara's auditory afterlife was nevertheless of striking severity. I am like one of Cowley's odes, says Herbert Quain, the fictitious Anglo-Irish writer invented by Borges in a short story published over 80 years ago. I belong not to art, but to the history of art. And Borges adds that for Quain, there was no discipline lower than history. Similarly, one might say that for Caldara, there was no fate more dispiriting and in his own day more unlikely than that of furtive footnote to the grand narrative of European music since the Enlightenment. In another Borges parable about the nature of pre-Enlightenment art, the narrator remarks with somber calm that, quote, "The poet was the emperor's slave and died a slave. His composition fell into oblivion because it merited oblivion, unquote. Well, if I believed that of Antonio Caldara, I wouldn't be standing before you tonight. Nevertheless, we are confronted with the unnerving truth that Caldara's music did indeed fall into oblivion, deserved or otherwise. To account for this dismal outcome, one must turn directly to the Vienna of Charles VI, his employer. And here is the redoubtable Emperor Charles in a portrait by Auerbach. For many Anglo-American scholars, certainly, Imperial Vienna remains the Vienna of Joseph II and of Haydn and Mozart much later in the 18th century. Even political historians have tended to draw back from the Vienna of Charles VI, who reigned from 1711 until his death in 1740, partly on account of the emperor's sheer dullness of character, his conservative temperament, his aggressive promotion of counter-Reformation piety and policy, and his indecipherable handwriting, which the historian Charles Ingrau has characterized as a symbolic agent of the emperor's own political and cultural mediocrity. As pretender to the Spanish throne, he resided in Catalonia for 6 years in the hope of accession. Charles VI seems to have led a life worn out by waiting and by expensive military campaigns. On his deathbed, as the story goes, the last word he uttered was Barcelona. But such apocrypha to one side, the most interesting thing about Charles VI was his unwavering assent to the concept of monarchical absolutism through the combined agencies of architecture, music, and the visual and dramatic arts. Literature, with the absolutely vital exception of theatrical verse, fared much less successfully under his reign and often barely registered on the imperial heartbeat. When a poet was summoned to Vienna, his duty was invariably to write libretti for the glorification of the imperial household. The same fate even more rigorously entailed upon the appointment of musicians, composers, singers, instrumentalists, the great majority by far of whom were northern Italians like Caldara himself. Under the direct supervision of the emperor, this vast retinue of musical personnel, collectively known as the imperial capella, was the largest of its kind anywhere in Europe. It was also an imperial noise factory, incessantly dedicated to the production of secular and sacred music to one undeviating end, namely an unrivaled intimacy between the divine right of Habsburg rule and the culture of Roman Catholicism from which it derived its spiritual and indeed moral authority. And here I'm just showing, as it were, the very heartland of that authority, which lay in the imperial chapel, which you can see to this day in the old palace in Vienna. That's really all you can see of its exterior. And when you go in there, you're struck by what a small building it is, but it was from within the environs of that chapel that the music of the imperial court fanned out right across the city. When Antonio Caldara was appointed to Vienna, virtually to the summit of this noise factory, he must have known, as they say, what he was getting into. He had certainly wanted it for a very long time. In his Roman days, he consorted with a galaxy of gifted composers, including Handel, Corelli, and Alessandro and Domenico Scarlatti, and lived within a cosmopolitan milieu of worldly princes and prelates, including Ruspoli and Pietro Ottoboni. In retrospect, at least, this Roman carnival, so to speak, must have seemed a world away from the Germanic stiffness and Spanish-derived protocol of the Habsburg court. Late in the 19th century, the writer Violet Paget, writing as Vernon Lee, painted a dismal portrait of the old imperial palace with the emperor shuffling through its labyrinths, this dull, crowned music master, as she called him, dutifully attended by his gouty and grave chapel masters, that is to say, Fux and Caldara. While Fux did suffer seriously from gout, but I wasn't sure if Caldara did. The court of Charles VI may have been renowned for its lavish self-regard, but it was not one known for its gaiety, although the English travel writer Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who visited Vienna in the year of Caldara's appointment, gives a lively not to say occasionally salacious account of Viennese society outside the court, and also includes a favourable portrait of the Empress Elizabeth Christine, whom she clearly liked. But as far as public court life went, the exacting demands of imperial ritual and religious observance throughout the reign of Charles VI took monumental, not to say oppressive, precedence. Here we come close to an explanation for the otherwise perplexing and drastic contrast between the astonishing life force of music in early 18th century Vienna, by which I mean the sheer volume and industrious enterprise of musical production, and the sudden disappearance of this repertory, with some notable exceptions, long before the French Revolution. It is to the late and great German musicologist Friedrich Wilhelm Riedel, who died just over 2 years ago, that those of us engaged in thinking about music at the imperial court, and particularly about church music, owe an indispensably detailed retrieval of the day-to-day sinew and fabric of sacred music as a primary expression of imperial culture. Without Riedel's landmark study of church music at the court of Charles VI, published in 1977, for example, I would have been quite unable to write the book to which Alan referred, The Musical Discourse of Servitude, a book which, as it happens, appeared within a few weeks of Riedel's death in September 2020. I shall, perforce, have something further to say about servitude in the third part of this talk, if only because my arguments in this address depend in large measure on that book. But here it is Riedel's empirical brilliance that is of account. That's just an image of the book. So, Kirche und Musik am Hofe Karl VI, 1711-1714. Even when we set aside the vast corpus of secular music produced by and at the imperial court, including the sumptuous and spectacular machinery of dramatic representations in general and opera in particular, the figures can be overwhelming. Riedel estimates that there were at least 200 liturgical services held throughout the church year within the environs of the imperial court and associated city venues, so that during Caldara's 20-year tenure in Vienna, from 1716 until 1736, we can modestly estimate that he and his composer colleagues provided or directed music for approximately 4,000 liturgical services. A considerable amount of this music was newly written by the imperial court composers, including Fux and Caldara. A lot of it was repeated from year to year. Some of it drew upon the archival resources of the imperial capella itself, and some of it was either specially commissioned or redeemed from printed part books elsewhere, such as the Masses of Palestrina, published in Rome in the late 16th century. What Riedel makes unmistakably clear is that this level of musical engagement was a corporate enterprise. The prodigious engine which drove this musical production and reproduction was not the individual artistic imagination, but rather the liturgical regime of Mass and office maintained, indeed imposed by the court itself. That is one reason why so comparatively few sacred musical autographs from this period survive from within the imperial archives. There are plenty of them outside there. Although nevertheless the archives hold thousands of scores and instrumental parts, all of them carefully preserved by the court copyists throughout the reign of Charles VI. All of these are now, of course, in the Austrian National Library. One example will make that clear. We have approximately 650 works that we can reliably attribute to Johann Joseph Fux, whose entire working life, or almost his entire working life, was spent in Vienna, but only 14 of those 650 works are preserved in the composer's hand. Riedel also concluded that the music produced by this regime was fostered in terms of a dynastic style, that's his term, in which the layered historicity of musical works was of much greater account than the contribution of individual composers. Perhaps the easiest way to understand the significance of this is to liken the dynastic style to the service music lists created by the great British choral foundations of the present day, as in the collegiate choirs of Oxbridge and in many Anglican cathedrals. These music lists very frequently promote an anthological approach to church music, from Western plain chant all the way through to anthems commissioned from contemporary composers, specifically tailored to the liturgical requirements of choral evensong or Holy Communion, so that the musical complexion of these Anglican services is at once historically gradated and stylistically coherent. We who participate as listeners and members of the congregation more or less know what to expect. But if the liturgical purpose for which these lists are created were suddenly to fall away, the music would lapse into silence other than as a means of private solace or contemplation. I think that is what happened in Vienna. After the death of Charles VI and the ensuing chaos of the War of the Austrian Succession, things fell apart, to paraphrase Yeats, and the centre could not hold. Without doubt, the former lustre and prestige of the imperial capella all but disappeared, so that by the end of the 18th century, it was a shadow of its former self. Vienna had by then practically reinvented itself, and the imperial capella no longer occupied the centre of musical gravity. It is tempting to add that if you were looking for gouty and grave chapelmeisters, these were much more copiously in evidence in Josephine Vienna than had been the case during the heyday of Fux and Caldara 40 years earlier. By then, certainly, the absolutism which gave to Vienna its prolific sovereignty in the domain of Baroque, opera, and oratorio, and likewise in the domain of liturgical music, was at an end. And as for Caldara himself, one cannot but wonder if his fate would have been otherwise had he remained in Rome, or like Handel, disengaged himself from the monstrous flattery of princes. Imperial and poet Vittorio Alfieri, thinking of the imperial court poet Metastasio, scoffed later in the century, "The coupling of those two words begets a monster." In Caldara's case, a very similar coupling of imperium and composer begat oblivion. Part 2, A History of Western Music, Chapter 99. All to be explained in a moment. Friedrich Riedel's own answer to Antonio Who occurs in an essay he published in 2011. The most important addition in terms of musical personnel to the imperial court, he says, in the early 18th century was that of Antonio Caldara, who, along with Alessandro Scarlatti, Antonio Vivaldi, and George Friedrich Handel, ranks among the most productive and most significant Italian or Italian-trained composers of his day. And for anybody interested in checking that out, there's the little reference, the statement I just translated there from German. Now, I think that I am right in suggesting that this is a judgment that deliberately or otherwise excludes Fux, but I'm not sure. I am sure, however, that Riedel himself conceded the, quote, somewhat old-fashioned nature, unquote, of Fuchs's compositional technique by comparison with that of his great contemporary, a discrimination which certainly gives me pause for thought, having devoted a good deal of my own time to Fux over the past, I can hardly believe I'm saying this, 40 years. But it really wasn't until I came to write the Musical Discourse of Servitude that it occurred to me how extensively Caldara had been eclipsed by Fux from the publication in 1872 of Ludwig von Köchel's wonderful biography and thematic index of Fuchs's compositions onwards. Thus far in these remarks, C has stood briefly for COVID, for the comedian as letter C, for the composer as the letter C, and for Caldara himself. But for my purposes, in the second part, it also stands for catalogue, complete works, and cultural history, and maybe also for classical music, as we'll see in a few minutes. You can perhaps understand a little better now why my alternative title for this address was The Composer as the letter C. If C is for catalogue, it is certainly a category that thus far distinguishes the reception histories of Fux and Caldara. Brian Pritchard, who is the doyen of Caldara scholarship and foremost authority on the composer, has estimated Caldara's work list at about 3,000 items. Indeed, if I am not mistaken, Professor Pritchard has for many years laboured to produce a corresponding catalogue that would set in order, at long last, the the magisterial unfolding of Caldara's art. I dare not even think about the complexity of such a task other than to commend it with the enormous respect and admiration it deserves. All I would add, especially in relation to Caldara's sacred music, is that this task seems all the more daunting on account of the dissemination of Caldara's manuscripts and copies of his music throughout Austrian churches and monasteries in the later 18th century. My own experience of this labyrinth is modest, but enough to suggest a pattern of false ascriptions of authorship, altered work titles, and associated difficulties. If there were an Antonio Caldara society, and there surely ought to be, it might prove easier to accomplish such an heroic enterprise. There is, naturally, a Johann Joseph Fux society, founded in 1955, but long before then, as I have just indicated, the process of ingathering Fuchs's works was well underway. This process has recently been transformed by the first volume of Thomas Hochradner's eagerly awaited Fux catalogue, which is a magnificent achievement in itself. I think that everyone concerned with the music of Imperial Vienna must take the same view and must surely long for the second volume of this stellar work, which will comprehend Fuchs's liturgical music, a body of work I strongly suspect as challenging to catalogue as Caldara's sacred oeuvre, although almost certainly smaller. But in the meantime, Fuchs' reception history in this regard remains far ahead. So I'm just putting up here these two images of the great biography and thematic catalogue of Kirschel, published originally in 1872, and in 2016, this phenomenal part one, volume one, of Hochradner's thematic catalogue of the works of Fuchs. This eclipse by Fuchs of Caldara, however inadvertent, is even truer in relation to the production of a complete works edition of either composer. I love the incisive quality of the German word for such an edition, Gesamtausgabe, which sounds to me like an array of gleaming swords drawn from their scabbards in one dazzling uniform show of steel. Gesamtausgabe, one for all and all for one. It just literally means a complete edition. But the reality is somewhat otherwise. In Fuchs's case, the Gesamtausgabe has been beset by editorial challenges which I don't want to detail here, except to remark that 67 years after its inception, it remains very far from complete. In its latest incarnation, beautifully produced by Hollitzer Verlag in Vienna, its future seems more assured, but no less protracted. In Caldara's case, the prospects for a complete works edition are much more remote, but even if this were to change, I'm not persuaded that in the case of either composer, a complete edition will redress the cultural and auditory silence that engulfs so much of the Viennese Baroque. To be fair, a glance at the internet would show that, if anything, Caldara is, for once, abreast with and occasionally ahead of Fuchs in the current market for early music recordings, and those sad days of representing Caldara's music through the agency of a few scattered ariae antiche are thankfully gone forever. And just a random glance there of Caldara, recent Caldara recordings, of which there are very many that have been made in the last number of years. But however impressively individual operas, masses, and other vocal works by Caldara now feature in the catalogues of mostly small independent labels, these represent a mere fraction of his prodigious contribution to such genres. And there is something else in relation to such enterprises, which is that they cannot hope to address the contextual meaning, the historical meaning of Caldara's music, no more than a Gesamtausgabe of Fuchs's music can represent, except inadvertently, the liturgical servitude that produced so much of what Fuchs wrote. This brings me to my penultimate C, cultural history, and indeed to classical music, or more properly, Western music, as the heading of this part 2 indicates. What do I mean by cultural history? At the micro level, this is easy enough to define. namely the extent to which Caldara has been part of the Austrian musical story, and in particular the rehabilitation of music in Austria and Austrian music that began in earnest in the closing decades of the 19th century. Köchel's Fux and Mozart catalogues belong to this history, and so does the proverbially monumental series of musical anthologies and editions devoted to Austrian music across history, which, as it happens, was inaugurated with a volume of masses by Fux in 1894. In a phrase, the Denkmäler der Tonkunst in Österreich, Monuments of Musical Art in Austria, which would soon feature a volume in 1905 dedicated to Caldara's church music, was self-evidently devoted to the cultural integrity of Austrian music, itself as an inclusive and legitimate historical context. There's just an image of the Denkmäler, DTO for short. But whereas Fux was to rise on the tide of this recovery, especially after the Second World War, the same can scarcely be said of Caldara. I sometimes wonder whether or not there was a degree of cultural chauvinism involved in this clear preference for Fux over Caldara, and not just within the editorial precincts of the DTO, of course. But in any case, the international complexion of Caldara's career, especially before he joined the Imperial Capella, problematizes his standing as a key figure in the Austro-Italian Baroque. On the macro level, and it is here that I widen the lens as promised earlier, the greater problem of reinserting Caldara, as it were, into the narrative history of Western art music in order to restore his immense significance, most especially as a composer of opera, oratorio, and church music, is, in my view, undoubtedly complicated by those stringent critiques of Western art music that have loomed so prominently in the decolonizing rhetoric of contemporary European and North American debate. Here we enter, albeit briefly, upon difficult terrain. August Kleinzahler's poem, A History of Western Art Music, chapter 99, was published in the London Review of Books in July last year. My appetite for poetry, which may be obvious even tonight, does not extend to this rebarbative screed, which nevertheless apostrophizes a more pervasive discontent with classical music as an agent of elitism, Eurocentrism, and so-called white culture generally. Kleinzahler gleefully envisages the entire collapse of this edifice and surveys its demise as a thoroughly well-deserved one. He scornfully dismisses those Euromen in monkey suits who, in his opinion, uphold a transparently bankrupt and ethically voided cultural view. Euromen in monkey suits, by the way, is by far the most palatable phrase in the whole poem. My absolute dissent from these sour and mendacious polemics to one side, the title of Kleinzahler's poem can nevertheless be engaged to warn against the add-on results likely to accrue from any attempt to disregard the current crisis in musical historiography, however well-intentioned our efforts to reposition Caldara might be. In other words, to restore Caldara as chapter 99 of the old story, let's say, from Bach to Brahms, is no longer the plausible exercise it once seemed. This is especially true of contemporary Anglo-American musicology, to say little of the soft power, as cultural historians like to call it, of American cultural discourse in general. For example, the late Richard Taruskin's Oxford History of Western Music, which I just illustrated there at the outset of this part, overlooks the entire Austrian Baroque, apart from a brief discussion of Fuchs's Gradus ad Parnassum, a theoretical work of admittedly wide circulation and immense influence, and an unfavorable comparison between Fux and Arcangelo Corelli. Caldara, by contrast, receives just one entry in the index to these 5 polyphemic volumes. Hi, Antonio. So one might well want to set matters straight, despite the canonic reach of Taruskin's reading, and give Caldara his due. But how? Taruskin's number one postulate for writing his history was that the literate tradition he surveyed was now at an end. Too late, Antonio. Richard Truscott was much given to provocations of this kind, but this one contains more than a grain of truth. We might modify it by suggesting that our essentially romantic concept of the composer as a self-standing artist and her works as autonomous objects is now adulterated by other concepts and also by a vast corpus of music for film, a domain not included by Truscott, and for other media too, in which the composer is almost as anonymous as a medieval craftsman. Yes, of course, there are exceptions to this state of affairs, John Williams, Ennio Morricone, Vangelis, and so on. But these are exceptions that prove the general rule. Moreover, neither the composer nor the music she or he writes can function in cinematic criticism and history independent of the genre to which their work contributes and indeed belongs. Film music as an entity defers to this generic whole, that is to say, film, of which it is a part. And I would like to argue that we might learn from this relationship between genre and the individual musical imagination when we turn back to the 18th century. It is this relationship between genre and the autonomous imagination that I shall seek to exemplify in the last part of this paper, coming up, you will be relieved to know soon. In the meantime, a full-scale biography of Caldara, which is yet to be written, notwithstanding Ursula Kirkendale's immensely valuable monograph from as long ago as 1966, a reliable catalogue, and yes, perhaps even a complete works edition, are of course desirable and deeply worthwhile undertakings in themselves. One could say the same for many other composers connected to the imperial court. But can we really afford to ignore the larger crisis now facing musicology, as well as the upheaval in value systems, which has overtaken the meaning of art music across the globe in pursuit of such enterprises? Or can we perhaps redeem from this crisis a more intimate relationship between historical context and musical meaning than we have hitherto allowed? These are open questions, but they must be asked, or so I am convinced, if a composer like Antonio Caldara is at last to be afforded the attention he so richly deserves. The alternative would be to ignore such questions and pretend we are living in 1966 or even 1866, in which case the result would be entirely predictable insofar as giving Caldara his due goes. What a cultural eclipse that would be. The great man theory of history has long been abandoned by most political historians. Perhaps it is time to abandon the great composer paradigm of music history as well, most especially in relation to the 18th century. Part 3. The Tyranny of Dreams in B minor. I hope Alan won't mind if I confess that the title of this last section derives from a striking phrase he used in his very first email to me back in December 2019. Alan wrote of the tyranny of distance that separates scholars physically from each other, no more dramatically illustrated perhaps than the distance I have travelled to be here this evening, and of how occasions such as this one could help to ameliorate this state of affairs. This led me to think of other tyrannies, including the tyranny imposed by time, as in the 3 centuries that separate Antonio Caldara from our deliberations tonight, and the tyranny that historical conventions can impose, not least in relation to how we understand and absorb early 18th century music in Vienna. It was partly, indeed preponderantly, an attempt to emancipate this music from those historical conventions which led me to write the Musical Discourse of Servitude. That book is only now, I think, finding its way in the world, but I should confess that its principal protagonist, so to say, was not Antonio Caldara, but Johann Joseph Fux in relation to Bach and Handel. Nevertheless, the last chapter of the book is entitled Steps to Parnassus, Fux, Caldara and Bach, so perhaps I am not as guilty as I might first appear of representing those blessed pair of sirens, that is Fux and Caldara, once again in Fux's favour. In truth, I think the converse is the case when it comes to my reading of the Imperial Mass in Vienna. That's just a transcription, as it were, of the contents of that book. And you can see there, just highlighted, Chapter 5, Steps to Parnassus, Fux, Caldara, and Bach. It's an unpardonable vanity, especially on this solemn occasion, to say that I'm quite fond of the title of my conclusion, which is Well, 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 Fux, Bach and Handel. It is not false modesty, but sheer pressure of time which prevents me from engaging too closely with the repertory and ideas which the musical discourse of servitude comprehends, not least because the greater part of the book is preoccupied by Fux in relation to Bach, in terms of their solo vocal writing and their settings of the ordinary of the Roman Catholic Mass, and also by Fux in relation to Handel, in terms of their Italian and English oratorios respectively. And this is Caldara's night, after all. But in order to privilege what I take to be Caldara's decisive role between the liturgical servitude of Imperial Vienna and the emergence of an imaginative autonomy in the very late works of Bach, I must nevertheless countenance Fuchs's masses here, given the importance of this genre in the formation of my argument. Both Fux and Caldara set the ordinary of the Mass, the liturgical words of the Mass, at least 100 times. Bach did so just once, very near the end of his life. The essence of my argument is that at least some of Caldara's Mass settings narrow the gulf between the servitude of Fux and the almost atemporal status and autonomy enjoyed by the Mass in B minor by Bach. Caldara historicizes Bach's achievement, but also contextualizes it. Fuchs's approximately 90 orchestral Mass settings are the locus classicus of imperial servitude. To examine these textures at length can, in fact, be a dispiriting exercise because they are completely removed from both the sonorous and self-effacing beauty of Fuchs's stile antico, or old-style counterpoint, and the formal composure, thematic invention, and dramatic intelligence of his oratorios, and his oratorio arias in particular. Stile antico as a term just requires a very brief gloss. It refers to Fuchs's assimilation and deliberate imitation of the vocal textures we find in late Renaissance counterpoint and as in the sacred music of Palestrina in particular. By contrast, Fuchs's orchestral masses obstinately subscribe to an unsettling sequence of short-lived and short-winded parodies whose stylistic restiveness excludes the prospect of compositional unity or closure. This grim adjudication, moreover, is both justified and redeemed by the evidence of Fuchs's stile antico masses, whose assurance and mastery give no quarter to the wearisome utterances of the orchestral settings. Although these stile antico works are far fewer in number, they comprise less than 10% of Fuchs's masses, their stylistic fluency and rectitude summon a degree of musical idealism far removed from the pompous glare and stilted majesty of the full-dress Viennese imperial mass. In the context of Fuchs's entire liturgical output, these works solicit refuge. It is impossible to mistake their composure, and it is unreasonable to discount or ignore their withdrawal from the clamour of liturgical modernity in favour of cerebral rectitude. The organic ideal of Roman counterpoint to which they gracefully aspire is in fact the Parnassus, the summit of Fuchs's own theoretical deliberations, which he published near the end of his working life in 1725. And this just is an image of the Gradus ad Parnassum, which you can see is, well, if you have Latin, you can see that it's identifies the author as Fux and as imperial Kapellmeister to Charles VI. And that is, in fact, the image of Parnassus there, with Apollo crowning the dutiful composer. Fuchs's smooth recovery of modal counterpoint is not only a withdrawal from the instrumental idiom of his own day, it also affords historical evidence of reprieve from the incessant servitude of the Viennese dynastic style, rigorously and fostered under the exacting eye of Charles VI, and its numbing constancy of musical production. The refuge and absorption of Fuchs's engagement with the stile antico allowed the composer some degree of emancipation from the controlling agencies which governed by far the greater part of his musical discourse. The lion's share of Fuchs's liturgical compositions proclaims its own submissive deference. These masses, however, do not defer. Instead, they fleetingly but unmistakably repudiate the liturgical Gebrauchsmusik or functional music, and hence the servitude which dominated Fuchs's career. They achieve, moreover, a degree of musical completeness and closure which is unavailable in the orchestral settings. Now, I mention all this because we find the same mastery of the stile antico in Caldara. And here I must acknowledge a vital essay by my friend Zhenyan Chen on the professional rivalry between Fux and Caldara, as evidenced in their contrapuntal and indeed canonic masses in the old style, which is to say masses written for voices alone and written indeed in modal rather than tonal counterpoint. More narrowly still, between Fux and Bach lie the late orchestral masses of Antonio Caldara, at least two of which significantly tauten the thread that connects Fux himself to Bach. One of these settings, indeed, composed before 1729 and deposited in that year in the library of the Elector of Saxony in Dresden by Jan Dismas Zelenka, a sometime student of both Fux and Caldara, is in the striking key of B minor. Caldara's Missa Matris Dolorosae, together with his Missa Sanctorum Cosme et Damiani, of uncertain provenance but probably composed between 1725 and 1730, are without doubt products of the imperial capella. But they also establish a perspective on Fux and Bach which recontextualizes the servitude of one and the imaginative sovereignty of the other. This is principally because Caldara's settings afford such compelling, not to say decisive evidence of structural unity, strongly sustained thematic development, and instrumentally conceived tonal closure. These masses, in short, depart the amorphous and uncertain condition of Fuchs's exemplars and approach instead the existential, that is to say, the self-standing condition of Bach's work. This is particularly true of the affinities between Bach's Missa, which is his original setting of the Kyrie and Gloria of the Latin Mass, of 1733, the vocal and instrumental parts of which, by the way, he sent to Dresden, and the Kyrie and Gloria of Caldara's Missa Sanctorum Cosme et Damiani. It is no less true of the affinity between the Kyrie settings of Bach's Missa and the Missa Matris Dolorosa, which we'll hear in a moment. In the present context, it is perhaps sufficient to add that these affinities leave me in no doubt as to Caldara's indispensable but often neglected significance to the history of Baroque musical thought. From within the shadows of imperial servitude, these mass settings by Caldara might yet emerge to form or contribute to an alternative history of the genre to which they belong. At the very least, they represent a long-suppressed episode in the European musical imagination, which does little credit to cultural chauvinism or the orthodoxies of musicological inquiry. This suggests to me that a new kind of fieldwork is sometimes required to obviate misreadings or simply inadequate readings, which can endure indefinitely under the protection of either one or both of these ideological phenomena. The servitude of Fux and the singularity of Bach, these would attain to a much greater historical significance, above all in relation to each other, if Caldara were more often acknowledged as a vital link between them. In this regard, the vital work of Janis Stockett, whose stellar essay on Bach's Missa in the context of the Dresden repertory, curated by Zelenka, appeared in 2013, is of acute importance to anybody who wishes to take this further. This next slide, and I worked through it quickly, is a page adopted from Servitude. It attempts to summarize structural and textual affinities between the Kyrie and Gloria of Caldara's Mass and Bach's Missa. His Caldara's Missa Sanctorum Cosme et Damiani. And, you know, I don't want to overburden you with a sudden descent into the intricacies of 18th century liturgical music, but I'll just take a couple of them. So Caldara's setting of the Christe is an 89 measure duet for soprano and tenor with violin obbligato. Bach's is an 85 measure duet for two sopranos. Caldara's Kyrie 2 is a choral fugue colla parte in old style. Likewise, Bach's Kyrie 2 colla parte in old style. Caldara's Laudamus is a 91 measure duet for soprano and bass with violin obbligato. Bach's Laudamus is a 62 measure aria for soprano with violin obbligato. Number 5, Caldara's Cum Sancto Spiritu is a 51 measure choral fugue colla parte. Bach's Cum Sancto is a 91 measure choral fugue colla parte, preceded by a 37 measure introduction. Caldara reprises his Kyrie 2 fugue as the Dona Nobis Pacem in the Agnus Dei. Likewise, Bach reprises his Gratias Agimus Tibi as the Dona Nobis Pacem in the Agnus Dei. And finally, and perhaps most interestingly, Caldara sets one and only one text in the whole Mass, the Domine Deus and the Gloria, for trombone obbligato, complete with introductory and closing ritornellos. Likewise, Bach sets one and only one text in the whole Mass, Quoniam tu Solus Sanctus, for horn obbligato, complete with introductory and closing ritornellos. Now, the parallels here are not in any sense intended by me somehow to prove that Bach knew the Missa Sanctorum Cosme at Damiani, but there is no doubt in my mind whatsoever that these similarities suggest that the Caldara setting, first of all, is much closer to Bach than we could ever imagine, and certainly much closer than to Bach than it is to Fux, and also that it not only represents a decisive departure from the kind of compositional technique we find in Vienna, but it also represents a prototype, if not a template, for the Bach that can scarcely pass over in silence. So in other words, there could be another, somewhere a triangle, and if we were trying to make a source, there could be somebody who's influencing both Caldara and ultimately Bach. I just don't know. But what I do know is that both the music and the structural features that I've just identified in that slide are uncannily alike in terms of the two works. An even closer prototypical relationship can be observed between the second Kyrie of Caldara's Missa Matris Dolorosae and the second Kyrie of Bach's Missa, and therefore his Mass in B minor. Just before I bring this talk to a close, let's hear the second Kyrie from Caldara's Mass in its entirety. It only lasts about a minute and a half. And before that, just the beginning of Bach's second Kyrie, just to the point where all the voices are in. And I'll just set that up now. So, let me see if we can find the... Oh, sorry, I have to go back there. So this is, I'm just going to play a little bit of this. This is the Bach, the well-known second Kyrie from the B minor. Oh, I don't know why it's doing that, sorry. Here we go. If that's to those who know the B minor Mass, is a very familiar passage, the opening of that monumental, vocally conceived Kyrie, dating from 1733. And now I'm going to contrast that with, or compare it really, to the second Kyrie from the Missa Matris Dolorosae, composed no later than 1729, because it's in that year that Jan Disma Zelenka deposited a copy of the Mass the Elector's library in Hanover. Now, or sorry, in Dresden. Now, this starts with the end of the Christe eleison. This is as close as I could get it, and then goes into the Kyrie. So just allow for the closing cadences there of this first section, and then you'll hear the Kyrie. I think that's the most remarkable recording. It's only very recently made by a superb ensemble called Ensemble 1708. It's very, very finely done, and using the Dresden copy of the Mass I've been talking about. Now, I presume most people are listening or hearing this for the first time, but those who know the B minor Mass will be struck by two things. One is there is an extraordinary similarity in the assurance of the stile antico writing, even though the fugal subject of Bach's Kyrie is more instrumentally conceived than that of Caldara's, especially in relation to the chromatic inflections in the Bach. But the most important thing is that both of these settings share a radically modernized approach to this stile antico. The modernity of this stile antico is entirely distinct from Fuchs's practice, and indeed from Caldara's ordinary settings, his a cappella settings elsewhere. This is radically reconceived and instrumentalized, and it establishes an affinity between Caldara and Bach, which I think has been almost completely overlooked. There are lots of other structural, textual and expressive affinities that I haven't had time to consider, but that would be the subject of a specialized paper. But a new understanding not only of the stile antico as evidenced here is required, I think, in relation to how we think about what it means when Caldara, or Fux for that matter, is writing in the old style. Fux would never, ever have written a stile antico passage of that kind. And I would gladly answer questions of that if they should come up. But for what it's worth, my own conviction is that these affinities deserve to be much more widely acknowledged, especially within the hermetic confines of the literature and Bach. You know, Bach scholarship is in particular, however prestigious it is very often confined by its tendency not to countenance any kind of comparison between Bach and the music of his contemporaries. Now, there are important exceptions to that, but it's a very strongly marked feature. It's less the case in Handel, but very often the kind of standalone approach to both of those composers tends to eclipse, to summon that word, any kind of legitimate degree of, as it were, cultural or even technical ownership that they might share with other composers, as in this Bach-Caldara likening. And just one, there we go. I'm just posting there also as my final or penultimate slide, the openings of the Caldara B minor and the Bach. They're uncannily similar. Bach's is vocalized there, but the original version of Bach's Kyrie opened instrumentally, just as the Caldara does, and the gestures are very similar. Now, this music is not perhaps in the eye of the storm, where Caldara himself is concerned, when we open out again to consider the totality of his achievement. He was such a versatile composer that it's difficult to characterize the signatures of his art within such a short extract. But no matter, had we world enough in time, I would want to press home the argument that within the orchestral masses he wrote, Caldara approaches the thematic maturity and imaginative autonomy we associate with Bach's admittedly singular essay in this genre. In these respects, he is much closer to his great Leipzig contemporary than he is to Fux. And in that proximity, we must, I believe, concede to Caldara a pivotal role in the high noon of the Mass itself as a musical genre. The cultural eclipse of this role in favor of Fux in Vienna and of Bach in Leipzig can no longer be borne. I'm almost there. Not long after I had begun to write up Servitude in earnest, I happened upon my copy of John Milton's poems, which I had read as a student of English almost 40 years earlier. I saw that my 19-year-old self had marked up a passage from Book 6 of Paradise Lost, which would eventually provide an epigraph for the Musical Discourse of Servitude. These were the lines spoken in Book 6 by Satan. At first I thought that liberty in heaven to heavenly souls had been all one, but now I see that most through sloth had rather serve, ministering spirits trained up in feast and song. Such hast thou armed the minstrelsy of heaven, servility with freedom to contend, as both their deeds compared this day shall prove. Those were very striking lines when I started to think about this relationship between servitude and autonomy. I could scarcely believe, in fact, when I rediscovered them all those years later, how closely that passage foreshadowed my own preoccupation with musical servility and freedom at the imperial court in Vienna and beyond. I leave it to others, I must, to decide whether or not I have succeeded in distinguishing between the servile minstrelsy of heaven and the imaginative autonomy I claim for the very late Baroque, and not just in Bach. But I have no doubt whatever as to which side of this contest Antonio Caldara ultimately belonged. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Professor White, Harry, for such an enriching and stimulating exploration of this fascinating period of musical history about which many of us, even who are so interested in this music, know still far too little. Now, Professor White has kindly agreed to take a few questions, so I'm sure there will be a few questions in the room, and also for those who are online, if you would like to post a question, you can do so in the comments field in YouTube, and we'll pass those questions on to Professor White. Just to begin, may I ask you a question? In the book, and also in what you've spoken about this evening, you've been very eloquent about the power of the liturgical music, particularly the constraints within which musicians like Fux and Caldara had to work in the situation in Vienna. In the book, The Musical Discourse of Servitude, I think your words were along the lines of, tempting as it would be, to talk also about the theatrical music. Yeah. You sort of confined yourself in the book primarily to the church music. Could I tempt you to say a little bit more about how you see that playing out in relation to the theatrical music and perhaps the oratorios, as well as the liturgical music?
Well, thank you very much, Alan, for that question. I feel like I should reply like an American academic of a certain vintage who would say, I'm afraid that's not my province. With all apologies to my dear American friends. No, but in fact it isn't. And the reason I'm saying that is not to get out of the question, but to say that in fact, my own doctoral dissertation was on the oratorios of Fux, so it's quite legitimate. And I have talked about the oratorios. It's not a liturgical genre, of course, but it falls under the general ambit of church music. And I think that one answer, which may surprise you or may not, would be that if you take the general understanding is that the oratorio is a kind of, well, first of all, it's a substitute for opera during the season of Lent in Roman Catholic cultures. And secondly, it's written by the same people, sung by the same singers, and often played by the same instrumentalists. So it is a kind, it's a simplification, but kind of a staged dramatic work, unstaged dramatic work, I say, performed. Which means that a lot of the musical apparatus between opera and oratorio are very similar. You don't, of course, have the machinery, except to some modest extent with the Passion oratorios, which would allow me to suggest, certainly from Fuchs's point of view, that there is more musical breathing space in the oratorios than there is in the liturgical settings. And this is particularly true of, for example, Fuchs's arias, Fuchs's da capo arias. Da capo is similar, it has the same sort of prescriptive force as a sonnet does in English. You know, there are certain things that have to happen in a da capo, otherwise it's not a da capo. As you know, you can't write a 13-line sonnet unless you're August Kleinzahler perhaps, but otherwise you can't do it. So the arias in Fuchs's oratorios are very similar to the arias in his operas. And in those arias you find a kind of degree of thematic autonomy, closure, instrumental thinking, as distinct from kind of pastiche and parody. And you have the sense that, because of course even as overworked as both Caldara and Fux were, at most they had to do one of these works per year, maybe two, but usually one. So there was more time to think out and to allow a certain leisure in the musical discourse. Whereas in the mass settings, particularly the orchestral mass settings, and a good deal of the liturgical music that's orchestrally accompanied, there is a very strong impression of haste and reliance on formula. So I think, the oldest story in the book in relation to this is that it tends to happen in Western music that when musical compositions expand, the generic number retreats. So, 104 symphonies by Haydn and 9 by Beethoven. So something similar is happening in regard to dramatic music. There's just more breathing space and less compression and less reliance on formula. So I think that's what I would say about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, other questions either in the room or Anthony, or you? So first of all, are there any questions in the room? Okay, do we have any online, Anthony?
We're still waiting for some questions to come through online, but I might just note a little comment that's come through from the UCD School of Music. Greetings from Ireland. We're delighted to see our chair present the 2022 Alfred Hook Lecture. So, Professor, you're in great company both here in the room and online. But hopefully we'll see some more comments coming through.
So, any other questions here?
Because Alan Bennett, since I mentioned earlier, has a good story of giving a lecture in Oxford once, and at the end of the lecture, it often happens in situations everybody's either too shy or doesn't want to ask, and finally some chap at the back put up his hand, and Bennett said, "Yes, just a line." He said, "No, I was just wondering, where did you buy your shoes?"
You spoke before about how everything fell apart at the end of this period with the death of Charles VI.
Yes.
And yet some of the music of the first part of the century did continue on. As you said, there are honourable exceptions to this. Do you think there is anything particular to the circumstance of Caldara as a foreigner, as an Italian there, which makes a difference to this, either positively or negatively, compared to some of the other composers?
Well, I sort of hinted at that a little bit when I said that, it could have been a sort of incidental act of cultural chauvinism or even a deliberate one. That, in the late 19th century, when the concept of music in Austria and Austrian music were sort of merging, and with the rehabilitation of Fux and other composers as well, but principally him through Köchel, I think that meant that the fact that Fux was Austrian as well as the first Kapellmeister counted for a great deal. That by virtue of his position, his music must inevitably be more important, shall we say, or more significant than the music of Caldara. Which is not to say that after Caldara's death, I mean, my understanding is certainly a lot of the liturgical music continued to be copied and performed throughout Austria, but its more general circulation almost stopped immediately. And I think that because of the emphasis on Fux, and indeed because Caldara was an Italian, but then most composers in Vienna were Italian. I mean, let's not forget that. Fux was exceptional. I mean, there were a few others like Muffats and so on, but so many of the singers. But Caldara's genius, I think, got eclipsed, got evanesced, as it were, in the storm and circumstance of finding at last a great Austrian maestro, a Baroque maestro, and that the person designated by history for that role was Fux. Of that, there's no doubt, and that continues after the Second War, when German and Austrian musicology, especially through the agency of Helmut Federhofer, who's an astounding scholar, the determination was to sort of enter Fux into the fabric, not just as the author of the Gradus ad Parnassum, but as a now revived master, not a Kleinmeister anymore, not a remote figure, but a restored figure. And the more that happened, the longer Caldara was, as it were, left waiting. I mean, this has changed now because so many younger scholars in Vienna are engaging with Caldara, recognizing his influence. I'm not sure, with of course the magisterial exception of Brian Pritchard, I'm not sure how much Caldara is of interest to American or English-speaking scholars. To some extent, yes, but not nearly commensurate with the attention he deserves.
Yes,
yeah.
We're gradually trying to change that.
Yes, yes.
Any other questions? Okay, may I ask you
This man here.
Yes. Sorry. Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
For those of us who are not as familiar with the output of Caldara as perhaps we should be,
Yeah.
I have a question just about technical impact, both from a compositional perspective and an instrumental perspective.
Yeah.
If you take Beethoven, so influential in changing the way that we play the piano, and Schubert was so influential in the way that things like chromatic media modulations occur.
Yeah.
For this composer, are there technical signatures that perhaps were left by him in terms of impact that were made on how vocals sang or instrumentals played, and how you did mention something about chromatic inflections earlier on.
Yes. Yes. No, that's by all means. I think is a great question. I think that the short answer is yes, there are, but far too few people know about them. I knew nothing about them before I sat down to write that book, because I just had this notion of Caldara as being just part of this, as I said, sublime noise factory, as part of this production process, because there was very little auditory or even visual evidence to suggest otherwise. I mean, there are certain masses by Caldara that people who worked in the 18th century have known for years because they were published 117 years ago in this anthology. But in the sense of becoming aware of music that clinches the deal and you think, oh no, we haven't had this before. The most important one in terms of his participation, his career really in Vienna, the most important one is that Caldara instrumentalizes vocal music. And what I mean by that is that he writes vocal lines that are thematically memorable and that are clearly influenced by wind and string writing in a way that is not nearly the same as Fux. Fux has a much looser approach to vocal music, which is which would have that kind of thematic closure and consistency. You do get it in the arias of his oratorios and his operas, but that's a much rarer occurrence. Whereas Caldara sort of stops the action in order to pay attention to an instrumentally conceived subject. Say, I'm going to do this pervasively, as in that thing I just played there. I mean, it's not at all facile. I mean, it would be perverse not to hear the obvious similarity between that and the B minor Mass. It would also be foolish to say that Bach knew that piece, but as I said, there must be something intervening between them. But nevertheless, that's the most important feature that Caldara, I think, achieves just within the Mass settings, the ones that I know certainly, that there's a very strongly conceived melodic closure in his thematic discourse, which is not only strongly conceived, but instrumentally conceived. So much so that even when he's writing in the old style, it's very different to the stile anticote, the Palestrina pastiche that he does practice in other works and that Fux uses in a small number of fabulous works. But they're much more austere, they're much more, turning away from the modernity or the modernism, really, of early 18th century music. Whereas that Kyrie I just played you, or other choral fugue things that one can hear, that is much more in tune with the chromatic inflections and modernity of a composer like Bach. I hope that answers a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I think that brings us to a point where we have catering waiting outside. We have some drinks and some food to restore us. Thank you again so much for such a rich and stimulating talk, which has made us think in a new way about such an important composer. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you very much.